Good evening. I first want to take this opportunity to welcome you to the 15th Annual Conference, International Conference on Central and Southwest Asia. It's a great honor and privilege to have all of you with us. We will have a few welcoming remarks by three distinguished individuals. But before we do this, as always, the center recognizes the outstanding work of some of our faculty on campus. And this year, we have three outstanding faculty members and three awards recognizing their excellence in teaching and service, not only to the University of Montana, but in particular to international education and to the Central and Southwest Asian Studies Center. So I would like to ask our three esteemed speakers, Commissioner Clayton Christian, Commissioner of Higher Education of the state of Montana, Provost Beverly Edmond, and Associate Provost Nathan Lindsay, to come and join me as we hand these awards. Please. And I would like to ask Provost Edmond, as the Chief Academic Officer and our wonderful Vice President, to actually hand the award. The first award is to a very, very special person, an incredible educator, a very popular teacher, who is really the founder of this program and the Central and Southwest Asian Studies Center, and that is Dr. Ardi Kia. Ardi, please. Thank you very much. It is also a pleasure and true honor to have with us a wonderful teacher, a wonderful human being, an amazing scholar, without whom we would not have had an Arabic language and culture program. And he's looking the other way. He is that humble. This is my very dear friend and colleague, Professor Samir Bitar, who has single-handedly created the Arabic language program, as they say in the Middle East, another 100 years. Samir, please.
Thank you.
And last but not least, a very, very special person, an incredible teacher, a person who has really held our Chinese language and culture program on his shoulders. He's one of the most popular teachers on this campus. He is responsible for the kind of ties and relationship we have with one of the most incredible countries in the world, China, People's Republic of China. And we have the honor of having four distinguished scholars from Shanghai International Studies Universities. Welcome. And much of it, please stand up and be recognized. And as we plan a trip, the bridge to China is Professor Zhao Chen. Zhao, please. Zhao. Thank you. So I have done my share of talking, and without any further ado, I would like to ask Clayton Christian, our Commissioner of Higher Education, to say a few welcoming words. We really appreciate you taking the time from a very busy schedule and joining us. Thank you, Clay.
Good to see you. Thank you. Truly my pleasure, honored to be here. This is a pretty amazing event, and it's certainly a privilege to welcome you all to the University of Montana, the Montana University System, and for some of you to Montana. Hope you enjoy our great state and the time that you get to spend here. We're incredibly proud as a system of the work that the University of Montana is doing in international studies. Dr. Kia, thank you for having me here and for all that you've done to lead international studies at the university, but also help with the International Institute. 15 years of anything is quite an honor. So to get to your 15th anniversary and have it still going strong is certainly an accomplishment, and congratulations on that. I'd also like to thank our faculty and scholars that make this department and make this conference what it is. We certainly appreciate the time that you dedicate to not only our students, but the scholarly activity to make international studies an important part of the University of Montana. As I'm sure many of you know better than I, there's a lot of great reasons to study international studies and to have international programs. What it does to help us get in touch with who we are as a people, from the economic global environment to culture and language and art and religion and all the things that bind us and sometimes unbind us as a civilization is important. But I also think it's particularly important in Montana. As you well know, we're a large state with few people, and to be quite frank, even less diversity. And I think through these programs, it's a crucial component of an education for a Montana student, not only to get in touch with the academic side of international studies, but also to interact with students and culture and faculty and scholars from an international community such as this conference tonight. It really does open doors and create new opportunities for our students. So it's my pleasure to be here to welcome you. Thank you for all that you do to open our minds and our thoughts to what is important around the world. I look forward to the next few days. I think you guys will have a very productive conference, and look forward to the panel speaking tonight. So thank you all for being here. Enjoy your time at the University of Montana. On behalf of my office and the Board of Regents, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be here.
The next welcome is by our Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dr. Beverly Edmond, please.
Thank you. It is truly a pleasure for me to be here this evening to welcome you to the University of Montana as you celebrate the 15th Annual International Conference on Central and Southwest Asia. I am probably a bit biased. I've become Montana bred, and so it would be hard for me to say that you did not pick the best place to host and to have your conference on our campus. Beyond the beauty of our campus, though, and the extraordinary amenities of Missoula and the state of Montana, the University of Montana has a long and rich history in advancing the importance of curricular significance of study directed towards this important part of the world. The University of Montana has indeed established itself as a national and international leader in this area through its faculty and scholarship, hosting of intensive language training, and educational study tours. Moreover, our efforts have supported connecting the campus community with leading scholars, diplomats, analysts, and a wide range of internationally renowned professionals. Such connections have been of enormous value to the entire UM community. We are grateful to the strong leadership provided by the Central and Southwest Asian Studies Center, as we are of the other academic units who have worked so hard to advance our footprint in this area. As well, to those who have helped by joining in partnership with us for this week's conference. We know that this is hard work putting together any type of conference, and when you're trying to put one together which brings people from across the globe, it is very challenging. So we appreciate all that you've done, and we thank you for your efforts. This program, clearly, as I looked at the schedule beginning earlier today and going on through Friday, represents a thought-provoking and timely set of topics for discussion. I, too, look forward to the panel presentation, and I know that this will be a truly successful event, and I am very pleased to welcome you to our wonderful campus. Thank you.
Our next welcome presentation will be by Associate Provost for Dynamic Learning, Dr. Nathan Lindsay. How are you?
Thank you very much, Dr. Kia. I'm delighted to be here as well tonight and to echo the words of Commissioner Christian and also Provost Edmond. The importance of Asia and all the topics that are being covered in this conference is hard to overemphasize. And if you think for a second, just a bit of trivia, how many of you know what percentage of the world's population lives in Asia? If you were to guess on a quiz show, the answer is 60% of the world's population. And not only the inhabitants, but all of the influence and impact of the various countries is incredible. And as Provost Edmond said, the range of topics being addressed in this conference is pretty impressive, the number of countries. And I sit on the advisory council for the center and have always been amazed with the ability to gather the quality of scholars and practitioners to address this conference. I'd also just highlight that this conference is only one of many things that this center, Central and Southwest Asia, does. That this is the 15th year, but there are many, many other outreach activities that are very impressive, including newsletter, trainings, brown bags that are very, very popular, Mali classes, presentations in the community to the governor, to legislatures across the state. And it's very wonderful to see all that outreach to help the community understand the impact of these areas. So as the other speakers have said, I'm delighted with the quality of this conference and so grateful that you're here with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Commissioner Christian, Provost Edmond, and Associate Provost Lindsay. With no further ado, I just want to remind you, my last sentence, that this year's conference, like previous years, couple years, has been co-sponsored together between the Center, Central and Southwest Asian Studies Center, and Montana World Affairs Council. And none of this would have been possible without the presence of this gentleman sitting there. Quietly and graciously, he has been there from the beginning. Robert Seidenschwartz, Bob Seidenschwartz, as we know him. Bob, thank you so much for everything you do for this community and for bringing the international issues to this community. You have been an incredible addition to this community. Of course, we should also make mention of Ambassador Mark Johnson, who is the founder of Montana World Affairs Council. Bob and Ambassador Johnson have worked hand in hand to make Montana World Affairs Council what it is today. So with no further ado, I will ask Bob to introduce our speakers for tonight. Bob Seidenschwartz.
As has been said already, putting a conference of this type together takes a tremendous amount of cooperation and people working from behind and in front. And I think it would be proper to also acknowledge my friend, my colleague, Dr. Mehrdad Kia, who has been so instrumental in leading this conference for the 15th year. So my thank you. I would also like to thank our guests who have come a long distance from Shanghai, China. I know it's been acknowledged before, but we as Montanans, the thing we do best is make people from various parts of the country and various parts of the world understand what it's like to be a Montanan. So thank you again. I heard the words in Montana, we don't have a lot of diversity, and I think what's being referred to is typically culture, ethnicity. I came here from Long Island in 1972, so I was definitely a minority. And I had that funny accent and I had that attitude, and Montana has been my home. It's welcomed me. It's allowed myself and my family to grow here, and my son, born in Montana, is a native Montanan. So I don't know if 44-year counts, but we'll see. But I was thinking about when he said diversity, and yes, we're a population that, from a cultural standpoint, ethnicity standpoint, color of skin, may not be diverse in that way, but we are incredibly diverse up here. There is nothing that can't and won't happen as you envision, as you imagine to be. And I want you to think, if it's possible, 20 years from now, think of Montana today. And if you're still here or you leave and come back, look at the changes that have taken place. Look at the challenges that we faced. The University of Montana will be front and center. We know it's gone through some tough times, but out of that adversity will come strength and will come a better institution. For the people that have remained and have stayed, they will lead us forward. So to all of you tonight, we came here to have some discussions that I promise you will be invigorating, they will be forthright, and they will present a perspective that I think truly has been lacking when we're talking about immigration and refugees. And for that, we have some distinguished speakers here tonight. So we have Shahid Haq, who is the head of his own law firm in Helena, Montana, came here 10 years ago and has Border Crossings Law Firm. We also have Professor Anthony Johnstone, who is a law professor here at University of Montana. I've had the privilege of having both of them, one today on the radio show. Anthony's been on the show several times, so we've had some discussion, some brown bag luncheon. So let's get started, folks, because that's what you came here for. So I want to thank all of you this evening. Give yourself a round of applause for coming out tonight. You will be better educated when you leave here. We will leave plenty of time for questions. Inevitably, there will be a number of questions. Again, on behalf of Montana World Affairs Council, I thank everybody who has made this conference what it is. So let's get started. So, Anthony?
Thank you, Bob. I just want to add my own thanks, how grateful I am to be. I wouldn't want to teach anyplace else. But the international programs and the way that they've enriched every time I've had a chance to come in contact, for example, through the Mansfield Teaching Fellows Program, talking about our Constitution with people from across the world, I always come away learning something new about our country. And you know, I even have a tie from, my tie is from Shanghai, the Shanghai Museum. So, so I'm going to set the table a little bit about some of the big questions about immigration debates in the United States. We've had them even before we were a country. I'll talk about that a little bit, the first century or so of, I'm going to set a little timer. So I'll talk about the first century or so of immigration, and then Shahid will take us into the 20th century, and then we'll come back to talking about some of the things that are going on right now. I want to read you a quote of a defender of refugees who, in really quite poetic terms, talked about how banishment of an alien from a country into which he has been invited as the asylum most auspicious to his happiness, a country where he may have formed the most tender connections, where he enjoys under the laws a greater share of the blessings of personal security and personal liberty than he can elsewhere hope for. If he, this refugee, is to be exposed to the peculiar casualties incident to a crisis of war, and possibly to the vindictive purposes which his immigration itself may have provoked, right, to go back to a homeland that might be under strife, if a banishment, if exclusion of these refugees be not among the severest of punishments, it will be difficult to imagine a doom to which the name can be applied. A very eloquent defense of our country serving as a beacon for hope across the world. The person who spoke these words, wrote these words in about 1799. Was James Madison, the father of our Constitution. Shahid and I had some discussions with people. The Constitution gets thrown about a lot in these issues. One of the things I'd like to do for these first 5 or 10 minutes or so is just help to set some context. There are puzzles. The law where it stands now is very different from where it has been in the past, but I wanted to explain the history of immigration debates in our country. As I said, it began even before we were a country. So that one of the complaints of the colonists in the Declaration of Independence was that the king has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither. In other words, the king was blocking immigration, hurting the country by impeding immigration and naturalization of foreigners to these new states. And so it's not surprising that immigration was a central concern. The interesting thing as a scholar of constitutional law is how little the Constitution has to say about immigration at all. In fact, the only discussion of immigration in the Constitution is in Article 1, Section 9, saying, "The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. So in other words, preserving to the states the power to control immigration. But of course, that's not about immigration at all. These were the framers using euphemism to talk about the slave trade. In other words, what all this was, it was not a guarantee or any discussion of free immigration. All this was a protection for the slave states to be able to continue the slave trade until 1808. Other than that, the Constitution doesn't say anything about immigration. It talks about Congress's power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, so bringing people over. Maybe that's a role for the federal government. It talks about Congress's power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. In other words, that you can decide what the laws to become a citizen are. But naturalization is a different question than immigration, whether you allow aliens to come and reside here in the first place. And then, then we have, maybe by implication, other discussions about the war powers, for example. The executive power of the president, maybe there's something there. But one of the first puzzles here is that the Constitution really doesn't speak to immigration, notwithstanding the fact that it was in the Declaration of Independence as a central concern. So where do we go from there? Well, the first real test of, really the first great political debate in our nation was about immigration. In 1798, the Adams administration, in a crackdown on its political enemies, passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. And those Alien Acts gave, this might sound familiar, gave the president basically full authority to exclude any aliens he shall judge dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. This was roundly criticized. It was never brought to the Supreme Court. Instead, a much more legitimate court, the Court of Public Opinion, judged this as unconstitutional by voting John Adams out and voting Thomas Jefferson in on the basis of a campaign against the Alien and Sedition Acts. Jefferson, on behalf of Kentucky, speaking on behalf of the states, talked about how our alien friends are under the jurisdiction and protection of the laws of the states where they are. And there's no power over that in the federal government. And it's a pretty radical idea. It's not the law as we see it today, but this was what they were talking about. Madison, in addition to saying that quote that I'd started with, said that the power to exclude and deport aliens was a power nowhere delegated to the federal government, something he might know about since he wrote the Constitution, right? And so very early on, and the judgment of the United States, the constitutional judgment of the United States, was by the election of Thomas Jefferson and the repeal, the sunset of the Alien Acts, was that these laws were unconstitutional, to give the president unlimited power to exclude aliens who he viewed as dangerous. Not much happened for a while. There were great amounts of immigration. There were cases again and again where New York or California attempted to tax or regulate or register immigration who are coming in. And throughout, the Supreme Court said again and again, that's a state's issue, that the federal government doesn't have the power over it. Until in the late, one other thing, after the Civil War even, and after the Civil War and in rebuilding the nation, drawing in great numbers of immigrants, we adopted the 14th Amendment, which is where our guarantee of equal protection of the laws is contained, and a further guarantee of due process. In the debates over that, this is in talking about who gets the benefit of these critical rights to equality and fairness under the law, they deliberately chose, they talked about first birthright citizenship. If you were born here, and this was eventually confirmed by the Supreme Court with respect to a Chinese immigrant, the son of Chinese immigrants named Wong Kim Ark, that if you're born here, you become a citizen. Right? It was originally passed to overrule Dred Scott and provide citizenship to the freed slaves. But if you're born here, you're a citizen. But they went beyond that. They said that you're a citizen and you have certain privileges and immunities. But then they said that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process, or deny any person the equal protection of the laws. Person, not citizen. That was a deliberate choice. In framing that, one of the fathers of the 14th Amendment, Senator Bingham talked about, or John Bingham said, the point of this was to provide equality to everyone in the country, whether citizens or strangers. So we all have rights to equality. Unfortunately, in many ways, we didn't live up to the promise of the 14th Amendment after Reconstruction in the late 19th century. We have Plessy versus Ferguson with respect to racial inequality. And in 1882, citing Chinese immigration that endangers the good order of certain localities. Partly a Montana story. In Butte, the labor unions organized against immigration. There were, imagine this, in Montana, even just 3 years into statehood, or even before it was a state, there were 12,000 Chinese immigrants in Montana. 12,000. I didn't check the population of Montana at the time, but that's probably 5–10% of the population of Montana at the time. We've never been a more cosmopolitan country nationally than we were at the time. They were wonderful. One of the oldest restaurants in Montana is a Chinese restaurant in Uptown Butte, the Peking Noodle. Pretty good. I wouldn't recommend it to our Chinese visitor friends. It's a great place. In reaction to this, though, the Congress of the United States abandoned the promise of the 14th Amendment and passed the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which in 1882 and for decades after simply said, no more Chinese immigration. And that was the first time that the Congress of the United States had enacted immigration controls and enacted them in a very broad, sweeping manner against an entire nation of people. And the Supreme Court upheld that, notwithstanding the lack of an enumerated power. The Supreme Court said that's what it means to be sovereign. It's an inherent power of the country. We're not going to look to particular texts in the Constitution. This was within Congress's power. The Chinese Exclusion Acts were extended. By the 1920s, there were other concerns, again, frankly, racial concerns, where they began to see immigration from Southern Europe and began to establish quotas, and different quotas, allowing more Northern Europeans than Southern Europeans in the 1920s. At that point, that was kind of the state of the law until the modernization of immigration law as Shahid practices it. But that's the background that sets the stage for the Immigration and Nationality Act that Shahid will now talk about.
Shahid, before we have you start, please, I just want to ask both of you, when you're having this, when you're talking about certain terms, whether it's Reconstruction or going through this process, let's assume that not everybody understands what that may mean and what the significance of that is. And also, as I'm listening to this, there's, I have to believe, economic pivotal moments, which really are the catalysts for many of these types of acts. So when you're talking about the Chinese as an example, I believe that was a reaction to Chinese labor is coming into competition with what I believe at the time was union
Right.
representation in California. So let's help give, and this, my apologies, that's my teacher background, give some of that insight and perspective, because I think that's very important to having the audience understand that. So thank you.
So I'll try to make our complex immigration system as simple as possible in a nutshell. I mean, immigration now under the Immigration and Nationality Act is such a complicated field of law that attorneys specialize in it and dedicate their entire careers to trying to navigate through all the complexities of it. But I'll start off with just some terminology. I mean, the term alien, you probably hear people say illegal alien or use that type of terminology. The illegal alien is not a term defined in the Immigration and Nationality Act, but the word alien is. An alien simply means a non-citizen. Somebody who is not a citizen is called an alien. And so if you were to use the term alien or to say illegal alien, that would be almost like saying an illegal non-citizen. So the terminology is a little bit, in my opinion, in our common culture, I don't think it's really accurate even grammatically to say illegal alien. But aside from that, there are really two main types of categories of non-citizens. There are immigrants, and immigrants really mean people who have the intent to reside in the United States permanently. Those are called immigrants. And non-immigrants are people who are here with the intent to reside here temporarily for some temporary duration of time. So non-immigrants, there are various categories of non-immigrant visas. And anytime you hear about an alphabet, they call it the alphabet soup of visas. If you hear about a B visa, that's a visitor's visa. An F visa is for students. An H visa could be various types of work visas. And these are all non-immigrant visas because they are for temporary durations of time. There's no H visa or F visa or any other type of visa that will let you stay here forever. So to stay here permanently, you need to be on a pathway towards getting an immigrant status. And there are various ways to do that. One way is through some form of family-based immigration petition. And if you are the spouse, child, or parent of a U.S. citizen, then you may have a quicker pathway to get a green card, basically. And a green card is what we refer to as it's basically a lawful permanent resident status that lets you stay here. You can't vote, you can't access certain public benefits, but otherwise you are entitled to live here and freely travel and return to the country. So there are family-based pathways to get that status. There are certain employment-based pathways, but it's very difficult and cumbersome to get your green card through an employment-based petition. That's because you have to prove that there's no qualified U.S. worker to take the job. You have to advertise and recruit and prove that you've done all the recruitment you possibly can to get a U.S. worker, and only then you can get a non-citizen to fill that job. So for people who have a bachelor's degree or less, the wait time for employment-based green cards is really lengthy, prohibitively long, because no employer is really willing to keep a job open for years just to hire a non-citizen. But if you have a master's degree or higher, then your wait time is a lot less, and that makes it a lot more feasible of an option. And then there are certain other pathways to get towards a green card, one of them being to request asylum in the United States or to be admitted as a refugee. That would put you on a pathway towards getting a green card, but it's not instantaneous. And then there are far less common pathways for people who are in deportation proceedings, for instance. Sometimes, if you've been residing in the United States for more than 10 years and you have a U.S. citizen spouse or child who is going to suffer extraordinary hardship if you were deported, that can be a pathway to get what's called cancellation of removal. And it's a really difficult form of relief to get because you have to prove a lot of hardship on the U.S. citizen, and they don't they don't take that lightly. It's very difficult to prove. And so that's the basic parameters of how one might get a green card. And then once you've had a green card for either 3 years or 5 years, depending on the circumstances, you can apply to naturalize to become a U.S. citizen. And it's not automatic. You have to apply, and you have to pass a civics test and an English test, and then you have to take an oath of allegiance to the United States. And so, in our common vernacular, people talk about getting citizenship as being, I often get calls from people saying, I'm married to a foreign spouse and now I want citizenship. You never jump to citizenship. You always have to get permanent residency, your green card first, and then you are on a pathway towards citizenship. So those are just some of the basic parameters of kind of the way our immigration system was set up under the Immigration and Nationality Act. But the purpose of the Immigration and Nationality Act was, one of the primary driving factors of it was for family unification. And so they defined family they defined it to give quick status to spouses of U.S. citizens, parents of a U.S. citizen, and minor children who are under 21 and unmarried. There's a quick pathway for them. But if you happen to be a child who's over 21 or a child of any age, if you get married, then you get bumped into a category where there's a lengthy wait time now. And this is something that has posed a problem for a lot of families. And in fact, it's something that drives a lot of illegal immigration, because you will have families that are split apart because, let's say, a U.S. citizen petitioned for their sibling, and then the wife and kids are included in that petition. So theoretically, once they've waited their turn and the visa's available, the whole family can immigrate. But if one of those children reaches the age of 21, they can age out. And then once they've aged out, then they no longer qualify. And so the rest of the family gets to travel, but the one child has to stay behind with no pathway to come in, a lengthy, sometimes 10, 15-year wait. And the waiting period is longer for Mexico than for other countries. So even though we share land border with Mexico, and even though we have a lot of immigration, and in fact a lot of undocumented immigration from Mexico, you would think that we might want to alleviate the undocumented immigration by providing a pathway. But in fact, we do the opposite by considering Mexico to be an oversubscribed country, and so we make Mexican citizens wait longer than everybody else for their visas. So there are a lot of things about our immigration system that are counterintuitive, or things that could be made to work a lot better, and we can talk about some of those things. But our system is kind of interesting. There are a lot of different federal agencies involved, and I won't bore you by telling you how it all breaks down, but it's kind of a really complicated flow chart with the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of State all playing a role in our immigration system. And so when people are outside of the country trying to get admission into the country, that the consulates abroad are controlled by the Department of State. And so the Department of State controls every consulate outside of the country where they interview people for student visas or visitors visas and all those types of things. So when somebody is inside the United States and they're applying for a benefit, that is actually controlled by the Department of Homeland Security, and there are 3 agencies within that. The one that interviews people for visa eligibility inside the United States is called U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS. And then we have 2 enforcement branches, which are ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or CBP, which is Customs and Border Protection, so the Border Patrol. And the Border Patrol operates within 100 miles of the border, and so here in Montana, that means that Border Patrol operates all along 100 miles of our Canadian border. So we do have Border Patrol that are active in this area and are, known to be pretty enforcement-oriented and aggressive here in Montana, especially in my experience. So just to tell you a little bit about my own practice, I've been here in Montana for about 10 years, and I live in Helena. And over the course of that time, I've come to represent over 1,500 people in various types of applications, and whether it be deportation proceedings or citizenship or visa applications. And so over that time, I've come to recognize various trends about what I see happening throughout the state. And there are areas where I notice racial profiling occurring. For instance, along the northern border, along Highway 2, towards, Highway 2 is what you would drive along to get to North Dakota. And so in reaction, I think, to the kind of the oil boom and other things going on in North Dakota, there have been a lot of, Border Patrol, and Border Patrol has actually been working with other local law enforcement entities to kind of pull over more Latino drivers and passengers, and that's just something that we've seen happen. And I actually brought a class action lawsuit on behalf of Latino drivers and passengers to challenge the fact that the Montana Highway Patrol was pulling over Latinos more frequently, and in fact, the Highway Patrol was holding Latino drivers and passengers just to inquire about immigration status. And immigration status is actually something that the states are not authorized to enforce unless there's some kind of special agreement in place, which we didn't have. And so in the end, the state settled that lawsuit with us, and we put a new policy into the Montana Highway Patrol manual that discusses what they can and can't do regarding immigration stops. And it's really clear now that they can ask about immigration status, but they have no right to demand an answer. They cannot prolong a stop just to inquire about immigration status. They can't hold somebody while they wait for immigration to come pick them up. So in other words, it doesn't matter whether somebody might even admit that to an officer that they're here illegally. Unless there's a state law violation for which they can be arrested, the state can't prolong their stop or hold them. So that was something that addressed a lot of problems that we were noticing. And it still happens, but I think to a lesser degree. But here in Montana, it's kind of interesting. We do have an immigration court, and the immigration court is just in. There's this little Department of Homeland Security office that is right across the street from the Helena Regional Airport, and one little room in there is designated as the immigration court, and it's very unassuming. It doesn't look like a normal court. The judges have called in from a different state. It used to be Portland. Now it's the judges will be in Utah. But the judges call in for status conferences. So my clients and I go into a room and talk to a speakerphone for all of our status calls. And then once a year, the judge actually comes to Montana during the summer, probably because it's nice and they want to get a vacation. And then they schedule all their hearings that week. So it's a really busy week for me because I'll have sometimes 10 final hearings all scheduled in 1 week because that's the week the judge comes over here. So a lot of unique administrative aspects of immigration law pertain to what it's like here in Montana.
Thank you for this. We'll continue this. I have a question for both of you. I think a lot of people don't understand the distinction between immigrants and refugees. And Anthony, if you would please add to this, what is that distinction? We just had an election, very contentious. You see what's happening in Europe. You see Brexit. So it's like tectonic, plates. The friction eventually builds and then it blows. And we see these type of events. So give us a description between, briefly, refugees and immigrants. And in Montana, we're dealing with that, which seems to be our issue at the moment. So Anthony, if you would, please.
Well, I might defer to Shahid on the definition, and I can talk a little bit about the current action by the president.
And relate that to the executive order
Right,
as you're having
right.
this
Well,
conversation.
I think
about
it makes
the
sense.
president.
What is a refugee? How does that work?
So, you know, a refugee is just defined as a person who has fled their home country on account of persecution because of their race, religion, nationality, or a particular social group. And the particular social group thing is something that is being developed. You know, not every social group counts. And so you know, there are two basic ways that refugees enter the country. Sometimes they have already been designated as refugees through a process involving the United Nations, and they've been selected as refugees. So when they come into the country, they are already refugees with legal status, and they're on a pathway to getting a green card. But it's far more common that you know, relatively few people are selected as refugees that way, because it's the numbers of refugees that are admitted depend on the president, and historically presidents have kept that number capped at a very low number. But there are actually more people who apply for asylum when they're inside the country already, and they might enter the country and right as they're at the customs booth ask for asylum right there, or they might come in on one form of a visa, like a visitor's visa, and then ask for asylum. And they basically would be coming forward and presenting their claim for why they should be permitted to stay here, why they're afraid to go back to their home country, and why they think they'll be persecuted if they do. And it's a difficult process to win asylum. It's not very easily
Is
granted.
it accurate to say that the majority of people who are given refugee status tend to be women and children as opposed to males, or is that not the case?
I think that would probably be true for people granted refugee status as they enter. You know, people who apply for asylum, I don't think that probably holds true for that group, but for refugees, I think
So
it's true.
refugees, it's threat of life, it's persecution. People coming on the immigrant side is it accurate, typically seeking economic opportunities as the reasons that they may come, and that's designation as immigrants versus refugee status?
You know, that's probably true. I guess the main difference is people who are applying under other statuses. I guess we don't know the reason why they came in, but ultimately they're not asking the government for protection because of their fear. They don't have to prove their fear. They're going a different path.
And the refugee process is an extremely difficult and lengthy vetting before you come into the United States as a refugee.
Right.
And a continuation of that once you are in the country.
Right. That is true. There are a lot of FBI background checks that go on. Oftentimes there are lengthy delays, and in fact, it's been the experience of most immigration practitioners that if your client is Muslim or coming from a lot of predominantly Muslim countries, then you can expect the FBI background checks to take a lot longer than they do for anybody else.
So Anthony, let's talk about that in relation to the executive order. And some of the rhetoric is that we don't have the ability to check people coming from some of these countries because the information isn't there, the data isn't there. So let's kind of make some distinctions between the purpose of that executive order and shed some light on, is that just a straw man in terms of that type of rationale, or is there a basis? Because that is one of the responsibilities as the executive, as the president, is for protection of their citizens.
Right. Executive orders, by the way, are simply actions, official actions by a president pursuant to some source of law. And so President Obama and immigration executive orders are not necessarily commonplace, but they're one of the things that presidents do as running the executive branch. They run the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security. They set policy, and just as President Obama issued executive orders, for example, supporting the deferred action for certain immigrants who had special cases. President Trump, one of the first things that he did was issue a series of immigration executive orders. On January 27th, the one with the biggest impact so far, although there have been some others we can talk about it, involved a ban on travel, primarily or ban on travel for individuals from 7 predominantly Muslim countries. And that was a ban across the board for including visa holders and lawful permanent residents who just happened to be out of the country at the time. So even people who could legally be here had been excluded. It also included a suspension of entry for Syrian refugees indefinitely. The suspension from the 7 predominantly Muslim countries was only 90 days. And this was done pursuant to a law that Congress passed that said in the 50s, so this was a different time, but gave the president broad authority whenever he finds that the entry of any aliens or class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interests of the United States. So that was his authority, and then he'd also cited his authority under the Constitution as the chief executive. The state of Washington challenged this law. It was challenged. There were about 30 cases across the country that are still going on. The state of Washington, a federal judge in Washington, struck that executive order down as unconstitutional, largely because of focusing on this problem of applying it to people who are who already had a legal right to come back to or come to the United States. It created a lot of chaos because of the way that it was rolled out. After the judge did that and the Court of Appeals upheld the judge's decision striking it down, that case is still in Washington, but the president on March 6th issued a second, narrower executive order that is currently what we're working with in this area. And that made a couple changes. It cured the really big problems in terms of barring travel for lawful permanent residents, I guess green card holders, as well as visa card holders. It no longer applied to those people who had legal rights to be here, but it still applies to everyone who's outside of the country wanting to come in, including refugees. As I said, that's still the subject of constitutional challenges in about 30 cases around the country, but that's the current state of play under the executive order.
A question for you, Anthony, on that. Did not the Obama administration have a ban on those same several countries during his administration? But I believe there was a very important distinction between what he identified in terms of who could travel and not, and what Trump during the campaign had identified. So, of course, the political rhetoric was ratcheted up, but the facts were really not vetted very well. So either of you, if you want to expand on that, please.
I think you'd mentioned that before.
Sure. Yeah. I have heard that before, that a travel ban already existed under President Obama, but actually there's a difference. That program was called NSEERS, N-S-E-E-R-S, and it wasn't the same exact 7 countries, but there was a lot of overlap. But really what that was geared towards was requiring special registration for entry and exit of people from those countries. So if you were from those particular countries, then you couldn't enter the country through any port of entry. You had to use a specific one. And you couldn't exit through any port of entry. You had to make sure you exited in the proper manner, or else you could be denied entry in the future. So it was a law that was targeting, in I believe, a discriminatory manner, people from predominantly Muslim countries, but it wasn't an outright ban on travel. It only imposed additional restrictions.
But what was the principle behind Obama's reasoning to do this? I mean, these were countries that were designated as countries of terrorist activities in origin, correct?
Mm-hmm. Well,
so there was a purpose to this with the previous administration. What I'm trying to do is just bring some insight and balance to understand how this came about, but then where did it get off the rails in effect?
Yeah, it's interesting. They I think they did justify it in terms of regions of of higher than normal terror, and but the list of countries actually first was reduced to 0. So as the program came to be disfavored, the list was basically eliminated. So the program existed, but there were no countries listed anymore at some point.
Or to have a program with no countries.
Right, and then eventually, the week before President Trump was inaugurated, President Obama signed an order to shutter the entire program. So it was kind of just a last-minute act to throw a wrench in it. So that there could be particular program couldn't be revived, and so it would take an act of Congress now to revive that particular program after it was eliminated.
But the political rhetoric was, look, the previous administration had this ban in effect too. And as I started to tell you in the very beginning, one of our purposes is to make sure you have insight and education to really what are issues that are not always very obvious in terms of the history and origin and outcomes. So Anthony, any comment on your part?
Well, and that's exactly why Congress provided the president this power. It was for better or for worse. It was very similar to the original Alien Acts that John Adams signed, but it's also very much supported by the basic idea that the president has a duty and probably a constitutional power somewhere in here to protect the homeland from terrorism. The question that raises with respect to all of these questions is that yes, but generally the government, setting aside whatever rights they have, generally the government has a duty to treat people equally and fairly under the Equal Protection and Due Process Clauses, and that really is the question that's been teed up by some of these lawsuits. And Congress also has provided some conflicting law on the area. They say in the 50s they passed a law saying that the president can keep out people who are going to be bad for the national interests of the country. But in the 60s they said, but by the way, no person should be discriminated against in the issuance of an immigrant visa, at least, because of their race, their nationality, or place of birth. And so you have these two different commands from Congress that the president is sorting out, as well as the constitutional rights of equality and due process.
So we're getting a technical kind of lay of the land here. I want to ask both of you some questions about some of the economic issues and principles behind this, because at different times in our history, immigrants were welcomed. In fact, were necessary for the building of this country, especially after the Civil War. We're expanding westward. We needed labor. Now, there may have been conflict, but nobody was saying no to cheap labor. So start from that period and kind of give us a little history going forward as to where it was welcoming of immigrants and where did they come from? What were the numbers that were allotted to certain groups coming from different countries? Where did some of that change? And then, of course, events, whether it's World War I, World War II, different sentiment change. So I know I'm asking a lot, but I think this is very important in understanding how fluid the situation truly is. So if you would, please, just answer those 4 dozen questions.
Well,
accurately.
It goes back and forth. I mean, largely immigration wasn't a national concern through most of this country's history. But remember, so the Chinese Exclusion Act was being pushed by labor unions who wanted to exclude their competition on the railroads and in the mines, including in Montana. Remember, 12,000 immigrant laborers. And so there's always been, and then you go to the great migration of the Irish or other European ethnic groups over time. They're being drawn here and welcomed here because of economic interest. Usually, it's not great in their country. There might be the Irish famine or war or strife that they're leaving, but really they're coming here because of the opportunity, and the economics drives that. But then there's always a swing back, a backlash, you might say, in terms of, but they're bringing different values. They're bringing, they're Catholic, for example, for one of the first waves of immigration. They
Which
look
caused the
different.
Protestants some consternation, by the way.
Right. There were some. There were reactions to. There's a great cartoon where you have this this school teacher by Thomas Nast, standing on this great cartoonist, standing protecting the shores and American children from these crocodiles that are actually bishop's miters, looking like crocodiles, crawling up on the shores from with the Vatican in the distance, and protecting our public schools. And this public school teacher was protecting. And what was he protecting with? With the Holy Bible, because the public schools taught religion. They taught Protestant religion. And so these debates have, and so whether you go from the Catholic immigrations, the other European ethnic immigrations, the Chinese immigrations, the post-World War II immigrations, post-World War immigrations, they've always been, we welcome you, we need you to build our country, but we're concerned about the impact it's going to have on it. And that's always been the dialogue over time, and I don't think we're in any different moment now.
Yeah.
Shahid, please.
Yeah, we always think that our current issues are very different than what's happened in the past, but there really are a lot of parallels. But speaking to the economic issue, I've heard it described as a secondary labor market, and businesses have always sought out a secondary labor market of people whom they can pay less than everybody else and treat worse than everybody else. And it's just an aspect of capitalism, I suppose. But their secondary labor markets included slaves, child labor, but also undocumented immigrants. And so there have always been aspects of our economy that depended on or relied upon a secondary labor force, and undocumented immigrants have always been part of that. And to give you a sense of how the interplay of our economy and how that can actually, in fact, draw in more undocumented immigrants, just one example is NAFTA. And not to get too down into the weeds, I'll try to make it pretty simple. But NAFTA allows for the free flow of products, but not free flow of people. And so one way that impacts immigration is that NAFTA allows for multinational corporations to locate in Mexico, for instance, and in a lot of, since Mexico will have less workplace labor protections and they'll be able to pay their workers less, there are a lot of companies that set up shop, and the workers there are mistreated. It's not a sustainable way to earn a living. And to make matters worse, there's the famous example of multinational corporations putting farmers out of business in Mexico by flooding the Mexican market with tortillas. And Mexican farmers were making tortillas. They were farming corn and making their own tortillas, but they couldn't compete with these corporations. So now Mexican farmers have to go work at the factory that's manufacturing their tortillas, be treated badly, can't earn a fair wage, and then meanwhile, there's this draw. If you just come into the United States, you can earn more, and even despite being undocumented, this same industry might actually welcome you and be happy to have you work for them as an undocumented worker. And so it's almost like these companies win on both sides, and the only ones who lose are the human beings who are caught in the crossfire. So that's one way the economic system.
Anthony, other comments before I go into another question, please?
No, and I hope at some point we can open it up to questions too.
We will here very shortly. Just wanted to ask both of you, and then we will open up to questions. Demographics play a very large role historically and to the present, not just in the United States, but in Europe and Asia, even China, a country with 1-point-something billion people actually has immigrants coming in to perform work. So give us the significance of, in the United States, from a demographic standpoint, the purposefulness and importance of immigration, and then broaden that out into Europe, which of course is quite contentious but necessary. So,
Oh, that's a tough one.
That's
I'm not going to make
field.
it easy, give you softballs, guys.
Neither
so
an
come on.
economist nor a demographer, so I'll
So, I guess just conceptually, a lot of the excellent contributions, immigrants have made a lot of excellent contributions to the United States. I'm not well versed enough to tell you all about that, but every country wants to have the best and brightest. And our immigration system has been known for being overly restrictive in that regard. So we have limited pathways to bring in people from other countries who can come in. So we make it difficult for people with PhDs to come in to the country to be doctors, for instance. We have a shortage of nurses, but we make it difficult to bring in foreign nurses to serve those needs. So our immigration system just really isn't keeping up with demand, and a lot of other countries, including Canada, are taking advantage of that by making their pathway easier.
So you think they're identifying key areas of the economy that need certain type of skill sets that are not being met by the population as is, and then looking and saying, we need people with engineering backgrounds, or software, programming, whatever the case may be.
Right. I think that's true, and I think a lot of companies are hoping that the U.S. will open up their H-1B visas to allow more workers to come in on that status as a specialty occupation, or make it easier to get a green card through an employment-based petition, or even make it easier for more seasonal workers. I mean, here in Montana, we have a lot of seasonal workers who come in to, say, pick the cherries in the Flathead, and or do other kinds of seasonal labor. And there are companies that would like to see more of that, but we are kind of going in the opposite direction. One lesser-known executive order that President Trump just signed last week was for a complete review of the H-1B program with an eye towards kind of reducing it. And it's already there are only 64,000 of them issued every year, which is a very small number when you think about it. And they're always snapped up. And in fact, there are so many applications for them that there's a lottery to determine who gets them. And now we're kind of, I think, looking, the idea behind the executive order is to curtail it further. So, I think, I guess that's
Well, and this is part of the discussion I want to have here tonight, is trying to separate fact from fiction, because this all is a circular situation that has effects and unintended consequences. So, Anthony, any comments on the question raised?
No.
Okay. At this point, then, I could go on, but you really don't want to listen to me. Questions, please, from the audience. Please.
I actually have 5 comments to make.
So there's a microphone, and you can
All right. And you know what, if you're closer here, I'll stand up here so you can share this over here. Oops, if I don't kill myself first.
Well, I'm not from here, but thank you for having me. It was a great discussion. It was just like a few points that I thought were missing from the discussion. I just wanted to add them to the whole thing. The first thing that you said, like some people say Obama did it, and they had a similar policy in place. My answer as a refugee, and I'm a refugee, so just because Obama did it doesn't make it right. Like for a lot of America, it might be about parties, and like it's about Democrats versus Republican, but for me, it's my life. So just because Obama did something wrong and we didn't know about it doesn't mean that now that we know, we cannot stop it. So that's not a good excuse. The second thing, I'm actually working on a paper to write about this, and none of the nationalities that were on the list, the first list, they actually had a terrorist attack in soil in the U.S. like for, I think, about half a decade. So the whole thing about the security, there was nothing to back that up. And if you read the court opinion, the court asking for evidence from the government, like why you're thinking these countries are threatening American security and they cannot provide anything. The third thing about the jobs and economy, I read an article in Economist, I think, and also the Wall Street Journal, and technology is taking the job. It's not the immigrants. And maybe it used to be, but right now, it's the technology that's actually taking over people and not the immigrants themselves. And if you look at the list of the countries that were on the list, a lot of them are in Middle East. So for them to illegally even come to the US, it's almost impossible because they're in a landlocked, and accessing the US, you have to go through like a lot of hardship, and people have to take boats and like go through the sea and ocean to get here. Thank you, just wanted to add those comments.
Thank you. Yeah. All good points. I agree with all those.
So one of the questions, as we're waiting for the next question, One of the things that the courts and lawyers are going to struggle with is this question of the government didn't bring any evidence into its first defense of that case, and the executive order, and why those 7 countries, why these 6 countries now, when the evidence seems to suggest that, you know, if you wanted to pick any countries at all, maybe you shouldn't pick countries at all, but if you wanted to pick countries, those aren't the countries. The issue, though, is that for a long time, the federal courts have been extremely deferential in areas of national security, and we'll have to see how long that goes. Basically, in the past, these are the magic words, a facially legitimate and bona fide reason. So what does that mean? Does that mean that you don't need any proof? Does that mean that it doesn't matter what the president was tweeting about on the campaign trail? That you can't look behind the facially national security? That's going to be one of the interesting things. In the past, the courts have been very sensitive to second-guessing the national security judgments because they don't have the responsibility, the same responsibility to keep the nation safe. At the same time, this executive order and perhaps this president seems to be testing some of the court's credibility for those things, and so maybe they will be asking for a little bit more. In the past, however, they've pretty much said, as long as it looks okay on its face, we'll buy whatever you're selling us, and that will be an issue going forward and a challenge in these cases.
Any comments?
Oh, you know, I guess I haven't said it yet, but in terms of the travel ban, I just encourage everybody to think about the fact that this would ban every single person from this list of 6 countries. You know, I can't imagine how one can really logically justify that everybody from these countries should be banned, because there has to be a more narrowly tailored way to exclude people you're worried about, but still allow some people in. It's just, to me, something that on its face can't be justified. I don't see how you could logically say that everyone from that country poses a risk. It's fewer than everyone. I don't know how many it is, but it's not everybody. So I think it's about figuring out how to more narrowly tailor that.
I wanted to build on those excellent points that were brought up. So one, and I would like to get more concrete answers. First, there were 7, and then they were reduced to 6. You guys did not mention Iraq was taken out. What I understand is that Cato Institute, which is actually a very conservative research institute, went back, as you mentioned, I think it was 25 years, and they could not find a single terrorist attack by any citizen from the 7 countries that had been designated. So for me, as an average citizen, I look, for example, at 9/11, and I ask myself, where did the terrorists come from? The majority we know came from Saudi Arabia. Then there were one Egyptian, one Lebanese, and so on and so forth. To my amazement, the countries which actually send the terrorists are not included. But the countries that in fact did not send any terrorists are included, right? And so it does raise an issue based on what criteria were these 7 countries designated, and based on what criteria were those countries that in fact their citizens attacked this country, this homeland, were actually excluded. And the second question, and Shahid probably, but Anthony also please, was this a totally bad way of writing an executive order because it was so harried, right, and overnight written, that they completely missed the whole issue of permanent residents and green card holders, and they included everyone, they threw the net? Or were they trying to test the water, right? And they were intentionally making it as wide as possible to see what the reaction of the American people would be. How would you read that?
I'm going to let them respond to the second part of your question. I just want to say something in terms of this your questions, first, don't confuse me with the facts, okay? And there's an old joke about a guy standing on a corner screaming, and finally somebody gets the nerve to go up to him to ask, what are you screaming about? And he goes, I'm screaming to keep the tigers away. And the guy says, but there are no tigers. He goes, see? You have to remember the context of the time. It's a political election. And in reference to your questions and thoughts, a lot is going to be said, which really is up to us as citizens, is it not? To take some time to separate the information, to get the facts, which means you got to get off your duffs and put down the tweets and the twicks and whatever else you're doing, and spend a little time educating yourselves so that we can have this conversation tonight. So that's all I'll say about that, and there are no tigers.
So in terms of how they selected those 7 countries and then and why they took Iraq off the second time, that's a tough one. There may be a good explanation for that I'm not aware of. But the other part of your question, in terms of the first travel ban, they didn't say that if you already had a visa you were fine. They didn't say if you had a green card you were fine. They just said that everybody from those 7 countries is to be denied entry. And so the question, did they do that deliberately or by accident? It's tough to say, but I think there's a compelling case to be made that it was deliberate to test the waters, because it sent a very decisive message. It said that everybody who's not a citizen of the United States has to be at least a little bit worried. That's the message it sent, and it was received. People are a little bit worried, not just people from those particular 7 countries, but people from every country except the United States. They're all worried. I mean, I've been getting calls just flooding in for people from Mexico, Canada, Europe, the UK. People who are not affected by the letter of the law are nevertheless afraid, and that's just because the stakes are too high for almost anyone. If you're not a citizen of this country, the stakes of being denied entry are very significant. I mean, you could be denied the right to be with your spouse. You could be denied the access to a property you spent your life's fortune on. You could be denied access to your children. So the stakes are so high that it sends a message to any non-citizen that you have fewer privileges than you thought you did. And I think that fulfills a campaign promise that was made. And so to the extent that it was testing the waters, I think that probably backfired, because the outcry was so significant. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. I mean, people were shutting down airports. The demonstrations against it were so significant that I think it actually ended up influencing the courts and emboldened some of the federal courts to enjoin the law, because we like to think that the federal courts are entirely immune from public sentiment, but in the end, I think that when you see outcry that strong, that has got to influence their sense of whether or not the law is rational or not. And so to the extent they were testing the waters, I think that it did backfire. And the second executive order at least reined it in a little bit. And so it's anybody's best guess, but I'd say it was on purpose.
So there's a theory, it's not mine, and this is one of the things that goes along with having an independent judiciary, that a president might do something like this precisely so he has a scapegoat for when the next attack happens. Well, it's not my theory. In terms of the rationale, so let's get more concrete here so that people are kind of surprised or disappointed with how the proceedings go. There's a real uphill battle with, once they've fixed the question of green card holders and visa holders who are 2 groups that have legal rights to be here. Once they're taken off the table, it might be entirely arbitrary. It might even be secretly religiously discriminatory, or at least not so secretly. But people who are not in the United States, although the equal protection and due process clauses apply and to protect persons, If you're not in the United States, you typically don't have enough of a stake in the matter to assert these rights. And so you're largely going to be out of luck. You're not going to get into court in the first place. If you're a person who has no other connection with the United States, that's going to be a major problem in terms of just the standing to enter court and the rights that you have. And that's one problem. The other problem, again, is that traditionally, maybe this is changing, but traditionally the courts have been very deferential. Remember the precedent here, the Chinese Exclusion Act. We're going to take an entire country, and it's not about terrorism. It's just that we might be worried that they're taking jobs away from other miners in Butte, Montana. And that was upheld. That's the precedent. Now, a big question that will be seen here, because we haven't seen this sort of big constitutional battle over immigration for quite some time, really maybe since the 70s with respect to sex discrimination, since the 50s maybe with respect to ideological discrimination against communists, and since the 20s and 1890s with respect to national origin discrimination. Those are the precedents that the lawyers and that the government are going to cite, and those precedents haven't been revisited. Now, there are two stories we can tell. We can either say, that's good law, immigration has always been special. We can tell whether it's one nation or 6 nations, you can't come in, you have no power to fight that, you have no standing to fight that. And that's been the case for every time these cases have been litigated. The government has won. Or we can recognize that those cases were all decided at times where we weren't very good at protecting people against race discrimination anyway. We weren't very good at protecting people against protecting people's freedom of speech anyway. We weren't even recognizing perhaps women's equality anyway. And so that maybe there's an opportunity here to revisit it. But the government has a very strong winning record on laws that look a lot like this. And I wouldn't expect that the challengers have anything but an uphill battle against the executive order as it's currently framed.
Got a question, Andrew? Question here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I'd just like to apologize for not coming more well-dressed. I was in a rush coming over here.
That's okay.
But you mentioned that the Chinese Exclusionary Act was mostly made because of the tension between unions and Chinese immigrants. Do you think that today, especially in regard to immigrants from Mexico, that the similar tension is sort of happening? That because of a lot of unions and American work benefits and Mexican immigrants not or aliens not having to fall under the same restrictions like minimum wage, do you think that that's sort of a similar tension today?
I don't think, I don't think so, actually. I think a lot of the unions, like SEIU, one of the big unions, I think that they are actually pretty supportive because they recognize that a rising tide lifts all ships, I guess is the way the saying goes. And, one of the harms of undocumented immigration is the fact that undocumented immigrants might be able to be exploited to pay lesser wages, which in turn might hurt U.S. workers. But I think a lot of the unions recognize that the solution isn't to say, let's kick out all the undocumented workers. The solution might be that you simply make sure that all workers, including undocumented workers, are paid a fair wage. And that by doing that, you actually make sure that everybody benefits. And so I think a lot of unions are taking the opposite tactic. There have been cases of unions that have stood in solidarity with, for instance, there's the Anaconda Mining Company operates both in sometimes in some parts of Mexico as well as some parts of the United States. And there were cases of miners in the U.S. going to strike in solidarity with Mexican miners to make sure that that they were treated fairly. So I think there is actually some solidarity, and I don't think we're seeing it as clear cut as like unions are against immigration or anything like that. I think that they take a more nuanced view than that nowadays.
Thank you.
I'd also like to add, keep in mind too, please, during times of economic stress, economies are always going through various degrees of stress. But remember what's happened since 2008, both in Europe and in the United States. We saw very significant downturns in the economies of the EU and the US. So when you go through these periods, it's natural to see the rhetoric go up. It's natural to see the facts get distorted. And of course, you get very protection-oriented when it comes to your own. And this is something, too, that is always there. It just has various periods of more tension or lesser tension. Economic growth tends to mitigate this because we all feel we're getting a piece of that pie. Oh, yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much for excellent presentation. Just to get back to the Middle East a little bit, what are the effects of this travel ban, in whatever form it comes out, on the minorities of the Middle East, who, on the surface of it, have a pretty good claim to either asylum or refugee status? Refer to people like the Baha'is, the Yazidis, the Jews, the Christians of the Middle East countries. Because if this Muslim ban is not a Muslim ban, what happens to these people's otherwise quite legitimate claim?
I'm going to let our two panelists answer this, but I feel compelled. We have living history here tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Ambassador John Limbert, who will be the keynote speaker tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, if you don't know this, was representing the State Department 1978, 1979 in a country called Iran when the Ayatollah came to power and held Americans for a period of over 300 and something days. Ambassador Limbert, 444, my mistake. He was at the Hotel Tehran for that entire time. So a little bit of living history and a welcome now to Ambassador Limbert. Okay, guys, answer his question.
Well, I'll just, so the first executive order made a reference, and it was often criticized as proving that it was a Muslim ban, but made a reference to giving preference to minority religions. I think it provided preference to minority religions across the entire refugee program, so not just in the Muslim countries. But that was one casualty of the insinuation that it was a Muslim ban, is that they no longer are going to prefer minority religions, whether Muslims in a Christian country or Christian in a Muslim country. With respect to the other groups and the impacts on that blanket ban, Jay?
Right, I think you're right. The people from a lot of different segments are unfairly caught in the crosshairs, basically, of this travel ban. So there are so many people who are being caught in the crosshairs, that people who would have valid claims to asylum you know, if the purpose of it was to target Muslims, they would be unfairly targeted because they're not Muslims. And in fact, they're of another faith. They were being targeted because they're not Muslims. So they would be unfairly targeted. There'd be students who want nothing more than to study in the United States and seek out a job here and benefit this country, who are being unfairly denied entry. They're family members of U.S. citizens who would be denied the right to get a green card and denied the right to be reunited with their own family in the United States. So there are so many people who would have no intent to harm this country, who would be prevented from coming in here. And so it's interesting. I mentioned this on another panel, but it's kind of worth repeating. The idea that this is only intended to be a 90-day travel ban is really disingenuous, because it's now been more than 90 days since the first executive order. And so if there was something that was going to happen within the first 90 days to open it up, it could have happened by now. And there's been absolutely no indication that the 90 days is ever going to expire. But for now, immigration attorneys are telling people to, if they have any plans to enter the United States, if you have family members who might have a right to come into the United States, do it now, for God's sake, because the travel ban could be implemented at any point. So.
Got a question in the back here. Sorry, Michelle. I had spotted this little lady first.
I'm interested in the contrast between the value of citizen and the legal status of person in the cases you were describing over the last 200 years of how the government has won when different cases of discrimination have arisen. Because the value of citizen, it seems obvious, that is at stake here. People value it. That's why they come to the United States. That's why they seek a pathway. But the value of person is a very different history or different story. And I'm curious whether or not that is going to intersect at some point in challenging these executive orders. And I think just of the way in which personhood has become more contested in our lifetimes through corporate personhood and also the debates over personhood in the courts about when life begins, and whether person is going to provide a new story of resolving the challenge of equal and fair treatment of people.
Yeah, it's a great question and a nice frame for I think the debates that the court is facing now. As I said in the past, the courts generally have not addressed this directly because they've said either that yes, you are a person, but you don't have these rights because you're not here in our jurisdiction. We can't hear your case. Or you're a person and you're here in this jurisdiction, but it's the president's job and not ours to look out for national security, so they've deferred. I think to the extent that these claims are getting a little bit more traction, it serves as a very helpful reminder that there are civil rights that citizens have, but our laws and our Constitution have a deeper tradition of natural rights that persons have, that we're all created equal, right? That's that goes going back to the Declaration and well before that. And so I think that's a wonderful frame to watch to see how this plays out. Maybe it'll get bogged down in legal technicalities again and go nowhere, but at least it is a reminder of exactly that, is that our Constitution regards persons as well as citizens, and our government should too.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for 2 more questions. And Michelle, please. And I know our panel will stay around afterwards if you have any additional questions or just would like to chat. Want to be very respectful of some of our guests that have traveled a great distance to be with us here tonight. So please, Michelle.
Thank you for this exciting panel, which is it should happen more often. Thank you, Merdad, for making that possible. Now, I a bit disagree with you. There is a tiger. Although I love tiger too much, I wouldn't. The metaphor bothers me, especially with the Wildlife Film Festival coming on. Tigers are on the extinction. But you know, they compare capitalism to tiger, like the Asian tiger. So there's a tiger in the room, and I would like this panel to address it. This complexity, this contradiction about immigration have to do with the system. Let's call a spade, the capitalist system. In order to, the capitalist system doesn't have much choice. It outsources production to keep profits, to keep consumers' price down, or it imports vulnerable population, right? Or also, by the same time, it's what our Iranian colleague said, the young person there, technology, robotics. Within 30 years, most jobs will be robotized. I mean, the job which require skills. So there is this contradiction, and people are caught in, you know. So we shouldn't forget that. The pure logic of the system which causes these fluxes of people and population. And then you have paranoia, terrorism, or, you know, the presence of the other. Remember the end of Rome? The Romans were incapable to accommodate the so-called barbarians, right? And then you have paranoia. Why does Merkel in Germany welcome 1 million? Good for her, there's nothing wrong. But the real reason that Germans don't make babies anymore, I'm sorry, it's true. By 2050, the population will be decreased. So Merkel, who sees far ahead, contrary to many of our leaders, she wants to import people to keep this production on target for the next 1 or 2 generations. So what do you think of all this larger picture? We cannot ignore the system, which causes people to, you know, to flux, those flux of people, and they pay the price.
Yeah.
Is that clear? Or?
Oh, clear, absolutely.
I think you make a lot of good points.
Yeah, you do.
So it's it kind of strikes at the heart of how our politicians talk about immigration. I think everybody knows that there are companies that benefit from undocumented labor and, in fact, rely upon it. I think that's not a mystery. I think that politicians know that, the companies know that. It's something that is willfully ignored because it's something that keeps the wheels of capitalism going. At the same time, there's the public sentiment and what they can exploit through paranoia and fears about losing jobs or terrorism or other things like that. So there's public sentiment, and sometimes there's conflict between those, where something that the public might think it wants because they're afraid and they've been whipped up into being afraid, might actually be bad for business. And so there are conflicts, and I think we're seeing a lot more of that now with crackdowns on the H-1B program and things like that, which will be bad for a lot of tech industries and things like that, but that's now what the people want. So it's kind of a strange balancing act.
So here's the point we didn't touch on, but we briefly mentioned demographics, and it goes to your point. The Japanese are getting older. They estimate by 100 years from now, there may not be any Japanese. South Korea is one of the oldest populations. Europe is not generally considered capitalist, or Russia, communist country. So I want to get away from those labels. There is a direct correlation between wealth creation and birth rate decline. So whether it's in Europe, Russia, China, various other countries, you have to understand that they are not producing enough new children to offset the aging populations, which leads to either increases in productivity or, as Germany experienced, they brought in Turkish workers. They had the need for workers that had work to do that were not being done by German citizens. Same issue is in France, the same issue is in England. And it wasn't people coming from the Middle East, it was people coming from Poland and Eastern European countries into Great Britain who were doing the work that in many cases the Great Britain citizens could not, or more to the point, did not want to do. So to get a broad picture of this, you really do need to understand demographics, the trends and the effects. Russia is another country that has a negative birth rate, hence some of the concerns and issues with their minority populations. So it's a very serious issue, and thank you very much for good points. Time for one more question, please.
Yes, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I want to talk about the president. You mentioned the president several times. And my question is there a mechanism in our current laws here in the U.S. that would allow something like jurisprudence of time and place? Can we revisit that precedent and apply jurisprudence of time and place? Because the situation, the conditions are different, as you elaborated. So that law from way back when that is sitting in our face as a president needs to be revisited.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. It's the same note that I began with. Actually, there is a precedent that would side with the challengers and against the government in the executive order, and that's the Alien and Sedition Act. It wasn't a court that did that. It was we, the people of the United States of America, who decided that we weren't going to stand for that. So in some ways, the best precedent for people who are concerned about the travel ban is the founding of this country, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to be able to step back from whatever the court says in these cases, and this idea of such an interesting concept of a facially legitimate and bona fide reason to discriminate. And instead think about the promise of the words in the Constitution, which, for whatever the limits were of the people who wrote them, was one of the most democratic and radical acts in history, written from a country that had a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, in Jefferson's words in the Declaration. So I guess I'd point you to both now, but in terms of a time and place, think about why this country was founded, and think about those values and how to bring those back into the legal system. It's nice because they were written down. We took the trouble to do that.
So ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you.